Let us consider for a moment existence in two dimensions. Let's say that we had these two rectangles here, hopefully that shows up on the camera, and they are aware of each other as much as they can be in two dimensions. They'll probably see to the left and right of each other respectively that they are two lines, and they can each move in the y-axis and the x-axis, but they can't move in the z-axis, or at least they have no perception of the z-axis. And yeah, that's basically the entire limits of their perception of reality. And yet we, as three-dimensional beings, we are aware of the z-axis. And more than that, we have the ability to manipulate these 2D beings. And so what I can do is now hold them behind each other instead. They themselves have not changed their nature of existence. They are still 2D. And the limits with which they could perceive reality haven't changed either. And yet because of that, they are now completely unaware of each other. It will be impossible for this one to know where this one is, even though they're the exact same states and they're still relatively near to each other from our perspective. But nope, entirely impossible from one to see the other. Maybe if we were to actually hold them up next to each other like this and even try to perfectly line them up, it might be possible that they would experience some kind of sensation, again in the way that sentient rectangles can, but they would have no way of processing how they were feeling this thing, because again they have never had to conceive of an in front or a behind. Now, while it may be difficult for us to instinctively imagine what being behind 3D matter is, in the same way as not being able to perceive it, that might be a little bit complicated, but if we kept on going higher and higher up the dimensions, from 4 dimensions anywhere above, they could do the exact same thing to us. They could take 2 pieces of 3D existence and move them behind each other, of course in a slightly different interpretation of the word behind, such that those 2 3D spaces, it will be impossible for them to be aware of one another. And that's how, when we start to think about that kind of dimensional physics, we get to the different planes of existence that we're going to be talking about in this video, in one respect at least. Hello and welcome to the Ragnarök Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is a channel where we just talk about the lore of the books that I am writing. I've talked about kind of other dimensions in this way, not in terms of the alpha realm and the beta realm, outer region, inner regions we have when talking about the nature of the multiverse in these books. And I don't mean dimensions in that respect. I mean, as I was just trying to explain through analogy, the idea that within the same region of space, you can then have different planes of existence, one behind the other, still consisting of the same kind of matter though. As I started to say, the time that I've talked about this before was to do with hypospace. So that's what I'll just start by relating once again. Whereas in conventional science fiction or whatever, I say that because it's slightly different in the Ragnarök Chronicles, where they're using the term hyperspace. You can watch the video on different kinds of star travel if you want to catch up on that. But whereas usually in hyperspace, you would be entering a slightly other plane of existence in which you would travel a relatively shorter distance, and then when you entered back into normal space, you had in fact travelled a lot further. In Minecraft, entering the Nether and travelling a short distance and having that relate to a large distance on the overworld, essentially we're talking about the Nether as hyperspace. But point is, meanwhile, hypospace, just as how hyperthermia and hypothermia are opposites of each other, in hypospace, that would be where when you slipped into a slightly different plane, you could travel a long distance there, but when you returned back into normal space, you would have barely gone anywhere at all. Now, what would be the possible functions of this? Well, you could potentially use it for storage. If there is this other plane of existence where essentially there is more space, a greater volume per bit of space in the main universe, yeah, you access that, you can fit more storage in there. Or maybe you need something to accelerate really quickly. Well, if you shunt it into hypospace, it can accelerate out there. And then when it comes back into the main reality, it's already at that higher speed that you needed it to be at. There's a few different applications there, but it is something. It is also, again, in relevance to the multiverse of the Ragnarök Chronicles, it is also where you have, or you can get a slightly more direct, like raw access to the material Zhang, which I've talked about in relation to Mansons and so forth, but that's not so much to do with it being another plane of existence itself. Talking about kind of star travel and other planes of existence, I suppose we could also talk about subspace conduits, the Ermics. But again, there's not really much to talk about in that respect compared to the other things I'll cover in this video in terms of other planes of existence rather than just how it functions as a mode of transport in general, which again, I've gone into detail on that in the different kinds of star travel video, if you want to check that out specifically. By contrast, a plane that I haven't really talked about before is that of the mirror dimension. Now, for it being called a mirror dimension, it is not a reflection of the main reality. As for all of this, we're thinking in relative to the alpha realm. It's not just a reflection. No, it's referred to the mirror dimension because it's through mirrors and the kind of reflections of that sort that are clear enough and undistorted that there is kind of a bridge potentially, or window more accurately, a one-way window from the mirror dimension into our reality. In this mirror dimension, the lines between kind of physical reality and more cognitive reality are getting a bit more blurred, and it is more existing in, not exactly inside of the reality's algorithm that I've again talked about before, but it's kind of on that level, kind of in the baseline of existence itself, where if you were to get in there, it is more, say, on a psychic level that you would enter and exist there, but still, from that point of view, you have a sense of physical interactions with everything there. And there's kind of a storage of your physical matter while there that then would kind of become fully realised again if you were to leave once more, assuming, again, you'd entered there in the first place. When looking out through these windows, i.e. mirrors, if there's kind of no one on the other side, like on our side looking into the mirror, then it is kind of just a free window. However, if there would be a living creature, by, again, definitions of living, like it's bacteria living, whatever, you know, just standard living beings within the view of the mirror, then the person in that dimension that is then looking out at them, they are compelled, they essentially have to mimic the motions and proportions and everything of the thing they are looking at. They have no control over it, they are completely at the whim of the motions of the person that they are looking out onto. So if the person on our side, say I was to look into a mirror this way, and I was to walk from, say, this side to this side, in the reflected version, again, the person looking at me would have to, with the exact same gait and motions, move that way as well. That kind of connection is being made. It is possible to break through completely, however, those are very specific circumstances that aren't met by. No one's meant to get into the mirror dimension in general, and I'll get on to how people have done in a second, but you're not meant to be passing backwards and forwards through there. So it is more of an artificial device and mechanisms that have to be invented in order to get one way to the other. And even then, like on that note, very few people ever have, probably that I could count on my fingers. But as for how people do get in there in the first place, well, I've mentioned previously, and this time on a number of occasions, I know, the Nelosium, the silent satellites. Basically this network of structures that kind of orbit each universe, and indeed permeate through the universes as well, unseen, wherein whenever a person dies, their soul is then taken up into the Nelosium, is kind of stored once processed in a simulation until such time that universes down the line, another body is ready to have a soul put into it, and it's kind of your turn, and you would then be processed out of the simulation again and into that new body. I'm not talking about the simulation inside the Nelosium as a different plane of existence, because that is basically just a simulation that exists within these computers which we can interact with. No, rather, sometimes there are leaks out of the simulation into the mirror dimension. Because the mechanisms by which the simulation is working is handling things which are somewhat sensitive to, the algorithm of reality itself. The algorithm is basing itself on what universes happen next, based on what these souls would do. There's kind of that connection there. So when instead you're artificially storing them in one place, there sometimes can be this kind of blips and anomalies wherein one can bleed through into the other. And so the majority of the population of what there is, not much, but what there is of the mirror dimension, are odd souls from across the cosmos that have fallen out of the simulation, fallen out of the rhythm of being reborn and living and whatever, and instead now just occupy this other space instead. How then do you have this kind of mix of physicality, which I also mentioned as well, in terms of if you were to go back into the world, you become physical? Yes, that doesn't apply to the souls that have come through. They are just energy. I'm more saying if in those rare cases where someone has artificially had a mechanism by which they can enter this mirror dimension more directly without dying and souls and whatever, that way their physicality would be kind of processed and then brought back again if they were to exit, which again is the small handful that I could probably count on my fingers over all of time. This kind of simulation and the mirror dimension, there are other planes that also kind of connect with it as well. There's a little bit of crossover and you can move from one to the other if you enter them in the first place of your own volition. But for the most part, those other couple of manifestations of those lower planes are more just versions of hypospace. Just again, sometimes artificially created, like how with hexagon technology, you can create artificial bubbles of outer region reality. But either way, yeah, because they're all dealing with the same level, essentially, of reality, they can, the boundaries can blur and sometimes just completely melt away. So you can go from one to the other if you find the right spot. At which point we now return to kind of what I was saying at the beginning, more specifically about forgetting about like your hyperspatial, subspatial, or other planes of existence, just having regular 3D space that can just be hidden behind each other, in from the point of view of a four-dimensional being or anything higher, which at this time we cannot within the Ragnarök Chronicles have things operating on a level higher than 3 dimensions. That's not to say that 4 dimensions and stuff doesn't exist. Even if like all life on Earth was to disappear, the 3D space of Earth would still be here. Even Earth disappeared, the 3D nature of the universe would still be here. Even though there's nothing in those 4 dimensions and higher, you can still see these different layers of 3D reality if you were to look from that perspective. And so what you could end up with is like, just as how within the kind of the alpha realm and the inner region, again explaining the multiverse, you have those realities kind of brushing up alongside each other because the atoms are just out of sync with one another. Whereas they're kind of next to each other and overlapping on that same kind of plane. Instead now we can also have, still within alpha realm reality, so it's the exact same kind of matter, just behind and so forth. We could have different layers of the same 3D reality just tucked behind one another, and the more and more of that you had, the more we can say that that point in reality would become dimensionally heavy. If we say that ours was the default plane of the alpha realm, then ours is the only one that has to be there. Has to. All of kind of the other layers behind, it's not inherently existing to the same scope. There isn't like a one-to-one matchup for all of the space. No, it's more that there's that potential for space behind there. There's enough room that it could be there, but it's more of an absence. And it was, again, I'm trying to choose my words carefully to not spoil anything, but through actions of some or others, there come into existence these other background 3D planes, or things from our plane get shunted backwards or forwards, or whichever way, kind of they can be moved between them. And either way, it's more you end up with these pockets coming into existence at that equivalent point in the absence. And so then, as I say, if you kept on having like, say this was Earth, and then you took another bit of reality and instead folded it behind Earth. If we then took another piece and folded it behind that, and folded it behind that, or maybe again on this plane, folded it behind that, over time, yeah, it will become dimensionally heavy, and especially also, this is in conjunction as well, is if you have people operating within hypospace, also on Earth. And if you had like a lot of activity in the mirror dimension happening around those same places, the more and more this happens, just as how with more mass on the same plane ends up producing a greater amount of gravity, and you can have gravity wells, which then attract more within themselves, so too would a dimensionally heavy space start to attract other things that are also dimensionally ambiguous. So you have within the Ragnarök Chronicles an object called the casket, which was used to imprison one of the previous Brethren Lords, Kieranat Raldazast. He was imprisoned in the casket by the entities long ago, and rather than just being held inside of this tiny chamber, there was a greater amount of space inside of it. In essence, this is one of those examples I was saying of artificial hypospace. It's kind of on that same level. So if you were to have lots and lots happening on Earth, lots all Earth and then other 3D planes behind it, and other hyperspace and whatever, if you were, hypothetically speaking, to take the casket with Kieranat trapped inside and just kind of pass it through our region of space, it would become kind of attracted and fall into the dimensional gravity well, and it kind of starts compounding, and kind of then, like black holes, when they merge together and kind of grow, so too would the dimensional heaviness grow, and potentially you could have a cascade effect. What does this matter? Well, just as how I said before, there could be, if you had two 2D existences, whatever, and you put them behind each other, actually made them touch like this, then might be able to be possible to have a sensation of it, even if they couldn't comprehend what on Earth was happening, respectively. We would start to experience those kind of things as well. We might interpret them as kind of major earthquakes or things like that, as kind of our reality starts to be dragged by kind of the excess inertia. Again, it's all relative to multidimensional motion, but kind of our being weighed down and dragged by all of these other planes around it as well. And so we might interpret that as earthquakes and stuff. And if it wasn't fixed, then, well, who's to say what could happen in that case? It would be very rare that we would ever get that bad. That even if you did have, say, a second 3D plane behind ours, it would usually just kind of coexist fine. It'd be very rare that you would end up having so much all overlapping in one place that things would really get that bad. Rare, yes, but even though, as I stated in the books, even though Earth itself, in theory, should be a relatively insignificant planet in the middle of nowhere, because people keep on still being drawn to it because of spoilers. But the reason why races keep on interacting with it for various reasons, and other things just keep on happening here, and there seems to be some importance, and, you know, different people using different technologies and different plans and different things across time in general. Rarity then doesn't sometimes matter in regards to Earth. So just watch out. If it starts to seem at any point that there's more around us than there should be, even if we can't really tell what that means, it's more of just a sixth sense. Hopefully that made some sort of sense throughout that video. Again, the main point I wanted to bring up was that principle, which is why I kind of spent the latter half of the video on it. But again, if we're talking about other planes of existence, as I mentioned in the end tag of last week's video, I had said previously to that we would do a video talking about the different dimensions at some point as well. So again, I wanted to cover all of the main bases there in this case. And again, we're focusing on planes of existence within the alpha realm specifically, not focusing on the other sections of the multiverse, so the outer region, inner region, beta realm, whatever. If you want to now check out those other videos where I had talked about those other concepts previously, as I cited in the iCard and said links below, whatever, you of course have those videos that, again, you can see. Alternatively, there are loads more videos on the channel as well that you can watch stuff besides, and of course we will be continuing next week. Although, more specifically now, we will now have take 2 of doing the next making a sequel video, which again, due to technical issues, didn't work out last month. So I'm going to try that again. Hopefully the computer saves the recording this time. But either way, have a go at that next week. So that's our, once a month break from talking about the Ragnarök Chronicles itself. If you want to get a feel for what that making a sequel series is, if you haven't seen it yet, again, there'll be a playlist that I'll link below and you can find on wherever. Again, you can look around the channel and find them. Either way, be there for that. We'll resume with the Ragnarök Chronicles after that in turn, and either way, for all these possible things that you can do, until I see you again, just remember to keep on telling stories.